Hi, everyone. Many of history's most famous revolutionaries didn't make their career as revolutionaries. Most did something else first. And Che Guevara, famous from t-shirts nowadays and briefly from a starring role in Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution, he started out as a doctor and particularly famous, made famous by the diaries he wrote as a young man and by the film made since, the Motorcycle Diaries. He was really influenced in his political beliefs and in his passion for life by visiting leper colonies and by the way in which he saw that lepers were treated in those colonies. Now, for much of human history, leprosy, which is a fairly innocuous and not very contagious skin disease, was treated with huge social stigma. People were exiled from their families and their homes, from their cities, and cast into colonies where they lived in isolation. It was often only religious communities, mostly nuns and others, who looked after these individuals. And that continued up until fairly recently, including the last leprosy colony, which was closed in 1957 in Greece. And I think of this because this week we read in the Torah from Parashat Tazria-Metzora, a joint parasha, where the subject of both is about a skin disease, a collection of them, really. Tzara'at, the disease referenced, is not leprosy, although it's often translated that way. We know that because it's clearly a category for different diseases. The parasha describes how it affects people's skin, people's bodies. It describes how it affects cloth and material, and describes how it can affect homes. Probably, it's something akin to bacterial infection, ranging from mold in homes to infections and open wounds and burns on people's skin. And we read in the parasha about the procedures for how the infection would be diagnosed by the priest, how it would be treated. And particularly right now, it seems very eerie to read some of the descriptions. In the middle of Parashat Tazria, it describes the person who has been afflicted with tzara'at as having to go out, covering their nose and mouth, ripping their clothing, and uncovering their head, so that everyone could see that they were afflicted. And as they walked in public, they had to yell, "Tameh, tameh," impure, impure. I imagine them ringing a bell as well. It's hard to imagine that practice of making someone afflicted by a disease identify themselves publicly, constantly, is anything but punishment. But our rabbis, when they look at that, don't see it as punishment. They see it as caution for other people and also compassion by other people. The response to the person who's afflicted with this disease is both worry and responsibility on behalf of the person afflicted. They have a responsibility to cover their nose and mouth, which they wouldn't have understood as we do, but nonetheless, and a responsibility to say and to warn and to identify to other people that there's someone afflicted. But the responsibility also extends to the people hearing that, the people who are responsible for taking compassion on the afflicted one, for praying for the afflicted one. And the rabbis see our description of the rituals of Parashat Tazria not just as punishment, not as punishment at all, but as treatment, which is both cautious and compassionate. And I think as hard as it is for us to see that, that's absolutely true. Because what Che Guevara saw in those leper colonies was unusual compassion. He was struck by the fact that these were few places where diseased individuals were treated like human beings, not banished, not abused, not neglected. They're treated like regular people. And that's partially what inspired his political beliefs, an egalitarian sensibility that informed his own activism. And for us, when we look at Parashat Tazria, we should really be struck by the fact that the Torah is always focused on how someone can heal, how they can get better. They weren't cast out. They were temporarily isolated, which we can relate to. They weren't banished from society. They weren't deprived of contact or treatment. They were looked after by the priests who visited after 7 days in quarantine, and then another 7 days if the condition didn't improve. They were given opportunities to reintegrate with society through sacrifices and prayers. And the disease wasn't seen as something which was reflective of any personal failure on their part. It was something which was a danger and something to be cautious of. And when we consider our own approaches today, we might find that Parashat Tazria and Metzora have more to tell us than we'd expect. The dreaded parasha, which no B'nai Mitzvah student wants, of having to read about skin disease, actually is more relatable now than ever. And it's relatable not only because of its content, but because of its message. Because when we're encountering illness, we have to respond with responsibility. Responsibility on our part as the affected, to be careful and to take precaution, and responsibility on our part as the unaffected, as the bystanders, as the supporters, to know that the person who's affected needs our compassion, needs our justice, and needs our ability to pray for them and to reintegrate them and to heal them. And ironically, although we see Parashat Tazria as being very cruel, it's actually very compassionate and very modern in many ways. And I hope that this year, when it's more relevant than perhaps ever before, we look at it with fresh eyes. Shabbat Shalom.